Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Greg Lukianoff. Greg is the CEO of FIRE, which has now changed from freedom of individual rights in education to freedom of individual rights in expression. Hi Greg, thank you for coming on.
It's actually Foundation for Individual
Oh,
Rights.
foundation.
In
Sorry.
and we are now the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression.
Yeah.
Now, people have pointed out that we're not really like a foundation, because usually foundation means like a grant making institution.
Mhm.
Then again, we do actually do the free inquiry grant now, so maybe it's more accurate than it used to be. But yeah, we get the freedom from, like the freedom start quite a bit.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, no. It's fine.
I don't know why I got that stuck in my head.
Oh, everybody does.
The first question I want to ask you, because I'd asked someone this from the UK, and I want your take on it. I mean, up in Canada, so unfortunately we don't have the First Amendment, which I think is like probably one of the best written laws for expression. But do people in the States kind of always fall back on the First Amendment? Like in the UK, you have the tradition of free speech, and you have Milton and Mill and all these people, and where a lot of these ideas came from, but you don't have laws codifying it. Whereas in the US, you have this law that codifies it, and it really started coming through in the 20th century when they had all these cases coming up. So is that kind of a limiting thing where people say, oh, well, we're protected by law, so we don't really have to care about free speech. Whereas in the UK, it was more of trying to protect a tradition, but there's no law protecting them from speech.
Yeah, I remember having this. My mom's British, and I spent a lot of time over there. And I remember having this sort of mini debate with Brendan O'Neill from Spiked in my backyard in Brooklyn in like 2009 or 2010. And there's this idea that free speech is better protected in Britain than it is in the United States, because it's a tradition in Britain that goes back a long way. And in the U.S., it's we tend to think immediately just of the First Amendment, which doesn't, which is the law, and it doesn't actually apply to non-state actors, with some exceptions. I made the argument that actually, ideally, you want both free speech culture and free speech law. But if I had to choose between the two, well, no, I'm not really sure I could really choose between the two. But it's good to have both, because you need the First Amendment when cultures go through a panic. I remember Brendan saying like, oh yeah, but people just hide behind the First Amendment. I'm like, when that panic sets in, I'm glad they have somewhere to hide. That there's something that lets you get through the moment when you're panicking. And it should be understood that when we talk about these panics, these panics are predictable parts of human life. Look, they happen every 5 years, maybe every 10 years. And I hate to think of what would happen to the First Amendment, what would happen to our free speech law if we didn't have such a strong protection during COVID. I think there would have been like aggressive attempts to make to pass anti-misinformation laws, and probably clamping down and sending people to jail for, in some cases, people who said things that were later proved to be pretty much accurate.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we don't have it in Canada, so I mean, I can appreciate the law because we're going through it now with our government. So before they had the election in 2020, they had an election in 2019. It was a minority government, so they called another one in 2020, and they were putting it through two laws. One had passed through the House of Commons and had gone up to the Senate. The other one was still being debated in the House of Commons. And the first one was, I'd have to go back and look at it, but it's basically, it came down to that if I was offended by something that you posted online, I could just make that claim and you could face up to $75,000 in fines and 6 months house arrest based on my offense of it. And then the other law was they're pushing it towards, we're protecting Canadian content. The Canadian government is going to decide what gets boosted, what doesn't get boosted. They're going to decide they want to control like YouTube and video streaming apps and things like that, and they want to push Canadian content. So, and then if you go deeper into it, there's some censorship in there as well. So I mean, we have had this coming through, and it's all like the one where the offense one that was all under the auspices of keeping people safe, and this one is just protecting Canadian content. So I mean, I really wish we had that, but unfortunately in Canada we don't seem to have the tradition of free speech that they did in the UK, even though
Yeah.
we're part of the Commonwealth. We were more closely linked to the UK than the US was. We didn't actually throw them, we didn't have a revolution against them, and we don't have the laws that the US does. So I mean, I see it here, and I wish we had one or the other.
Yeah.
We honestly don't seem to.
Yeah. Now the situation for free speech in Canada, and I'm reading this book by Lee Bollinger, who's the president of Columbia, which, by the way, finished dead last of 212 schools that we did polls about for free speech. A genuine surprise to me. I didn't think it was going to actually. I didn't think it was going to do great, but dead last I didn't see coming. And Jeff Stone, someone who I do respect, but they've done a series of books of essays by honestly just very well known, well established, no matter how good their opinions are and stuff on freedom of speech issues. Their free speech century book was just not good. And now they're doing one on social media, and the extent to which sort of like the American elite think that everywhere but the United States has things right on free speech. For those of us who, my dad grew up in Yugoslavia, my mother's British, I've traveled a lot. It just kind of blows me away, because it's kind of like, and mentioning Canada as a model that we could follow, and I'm like, are you nuts? Like the situation for free speech in Canada is terrible.
Oh, it's awful. No, but I don't want to digress too far into Canada. But you'd mentioned your list, like, and I know Fire has been doing this for a while. I mean, what, 20 plus years now?
Well, we added a really important element to it a couple of years ago. Initially, the way we would do, starting way back in 2007, we would do an annual report. I mean, actually, the project itself started like before I even got to Fire in 2001, and there's not a lot of time in Fire's existence before I got there, because I joined in 2001 and it was founded in 99. And I was originally legal director, and I actually had to evaluate the speech codes on university campus myself. And that wasn't rigorous enough for me. So we had to wait until we had like a dedicated lawyer. In this case, Samantha Harris was a dedicated lawyer, and she's very meticulous. And so we started publishing our take on their speech codes about whether or not we thought they stood up to First Amendment muster back in 2007. And at first we found about 79% of schools had laughably unconstitutional codes, even if they were, bound by the First Amendment and they were flat out illegal. Then we added something in 2012, which I thought was essential, which is our worst schools for free speech list that we do every year, based on really bad incidents, to really call schools out for that. But the game changer was, I think 2019 was when we started working with College Pulse and could evaluate. We actually could poll students directly about what they think about the atmosphere for free speech on their campuses are. And that's when we started doing a ranking from like first to last. And University of Chicago finished first again this year, which, I almost don't like, because it's so predictable. And we were suspicious of it when it first came through, but they really do work towards that. And the dead last this year were Columbia, like I mentioned, Penn. The only like high ranking liberal arts college in the United States was actually Claremont McKenna, which has made a real effort to do better on free speech since a couple of really embarrassing things happened, including with Heather McDonald, who tried to speak there maybe 6-7 years ago.
Okay, so like we were talking just a little before. So I was out of the country for 12 years. Then I was living in a remote community. But when I got back to Canada, I left in 2002. I got back in 2014. And when I left, it was, even though Canada's not great on free speech, it was still that, I don't agree with what you say, but I'll respect your right to say it. And when I got back, I mean, I was basically seeing de facto blasphemy laws.
Yeah.
And then I got called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam. And that's a lot of it around 2014 was, shutting down speech because of what you said about Islam, or that's what I saw in my little circles. And so I started looking into it. But then I saw what was going on campus. Now, my worry about this is, especially when you read something like Jonathan Rauch's book, Kindly Inquisitors, and you see how far back this really goes. I mean, you can go even further back than that, but I was like, okay, so you've had, at that point I said, okay, you've had 15 years where this has been growing on campus. Now you're seeing it come off into real life.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like speech codes, and we can get into these maybe later, but like, I don't like a lot of the laws coming out, like especially that like, I like where they might be coming from, like their intentions might be good, but what they're doing is bad, like the Stop Woke Act in Florida and things like that. If the colleges themselves are pushing out this kind of idea, and if this is being pushed on the universities as these people graduate and get into life, that culture is going to die out, so that at one point or other, someone can say, well, we do need to change the First Amendment. We do need to change this law because it's no longer quote unquote a good law. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, there's my concern from it. And then, the other side of it is I worry about the overreactions, like the overcorrections, which I think some of these, like call them anti-CRT laws or whatever. These laws are overcorrections to an actual problem, but it's not going about it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were talking about the Stop Woke Act in particular in Florida, which was a law applied to K through 12 to ban the teaching of quote unquote divisive concepts. But what distinguishes it also applies to higher education. And we've sued against that because we think there's absolutely no question, at least on existing law, that this is laughably unconstitutional. Meanwhile, and we've definitely had some people, like FIRE is the most nonpartisan organization out there. So sometimes you'll have conservatives feel like we betrayed them. It's like, sorry, it's like that's not the way we work. We always we call balls and strikes just like we see them, even if that means we lose donors over it. And always have. But when it comes to that way of trying to reform higher ed, I also think it's a dead end. I mean, one, it's against the law, so it's not going to work anyway. But two, the one thing that you want to avoid is that a lot of the worst activists, among the administrations on American college campuses, they love an opportunity to say, we're the real victims here. We're the ones who are really under threat. And this is exactly what's happened due to these laws, is you have, organizations saying that, and now when I talk about, threats from the left on campus, immediately people, well, one, they just want to know, like, where were we in HB 7? I'm like, we're suing against it, but they assume we're not, because, and sometimes they don't even bother to check it. But it's given them an excuse to not think about, problems on their own campus. Meanwhile, I don't think that even if they were constitutional, these kind of laws would make much of a difference anyway, because there are so many ways to sort of, once you have the kind of political supermajority that you have on campus, where it's incredibly politically homogenous, it's going to lead to ideological problems, and keep perpetuating themselves. And it's going to get worse, by the way, on campus. When I think about what could actually be done that actually might make a difference, is things that, allow other ways that young people can prove they're the best and the brightest without going to college, or some alternative to it. I also think we have to massively debureaucratize American higher education. I think it's outrageous that you have this hue and cry appropriately from the fact that you have Americans who are saddled with tremendous amounts of debt, of university debt. And I get them being resentful and angry about this, because their parents and their grandparents certainly didn't have to do anything like that. They could pay for college, by working an outside job, at one point in American history. But the fact that none of that anger is directed towards higher education itself is really blows me away. It's kind of like, no. So this was an industry that has become incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential, employs a huge number of people, many of whom I don't believe they need at all. But the focus doesn't. They seem to be completely Teflon on this stuff, and it's like, No, like this is why forgiving student debt the way we did was a mistake, and it wasn't an unintentional mistake. The Democrats in modern higher ed are very simpatico. And there was no discussion, meaningfully at least, of reducing the actual expense side. There was. It's funny. I watched a couple of people kind of flail when I made this point, and they're like, "Well, no, Biden was talking about keeping costs down." I'm like, "No. He was talking about keeping costs down to consumers, which is, of course, a laudable goal. Nothing about actually decreasing how expensive the institutions themselves are." And I think that we should be looking for ways to start decreasing the expensiveness of higher education, on their side, not just the cost. And I think that a university that was less reliant on administrators, less reliant on the bureaucracy would actually be almost by default a much freer place than we currently see, because still a big part of the threat actually comes from administrators themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things with the colleges. I always, the example I use is if the physics department goes into the English department and says you're not doing English correctly, the English department's going to laugh at them.
Yeah.
And, same thing if the English department comes to the physics department and says you're not doing physics correctly, and, rightfully so, they're going to laugh at them. But if an administrator who has a PhD in, gender studies or sociology focusing on critical race theory or whatever, or anti-racism, and comes in and says, well, physics department is racist. They look at that PhD and it's like, well, this person's got, earned knowledge, blah, 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 blah. We have to respect them. And it's like the university never even checked themselves. I don't want to limit what if a university wants to have a chair in alchemy, go ahead. You're going to be laughed out of, people are going to laugh at you, but that alchemy chair should not be then allowed to dictate policy on how that school runs science. And I think it's the same thing with a lot of these studies courses and the anti-racism and whatever. Universities haven't paid attention to themselves. They've kind of siloed themselves off, and they're just assuming that everyone has the best intentions, and they're just kind of letting it go. And it's like my way of approaching it would be, okay, let's try to get alumni and students and whatever, push the university to say, okay, these people aren't credible. Let's not use their theories to create policy for the university. Which I think would be a good way to go about it. But it shouldn't come through force of law.
Right.
Yeah. I think about what would actually make some of the biggest difference. And I think that I've advocated for something where if students were taking AP classes and taking those AP exams, if they had both a pass and a high pass, where essentially, and then you'd be invited back, to do the next level of AP exams. And if you get a high pass, you get invited to super university where it's, I think just being able to get at some of the best and brightest and hardest working kids by itself, having something that could really credential them would scare the living daylights out of American elite higher education, where a lot of the problems we see, not just among college graduates, but societally. And the funny thing is, people were pointing out that this was coming, as early as the 80s, saying that this is getting much too ideological. It's much too activist. And of course, at the time, campus was like, no, we don't promote activism, and of course now they don't even bother to make that argument. Like that argument's almost entirely fallen out because it's like, oh yeah, well sure, we do that. And I think that we have to be creative in ways to figure out to allow to sort of put American higher education in a situation where they actually feel like they have to compete again for their incredible privilege.
Yeah, I mean, Harvard kind of takes it for granted that, everyone wants to come to Harvard because you get the Harvard degree. But I mean, some of the stuff coming out of Harvard is kind of laughable. I can't remember if it was Harvard or Cornell that put out that thing about correct grammar being racist or something like that. And it just, okay, there's always been, I went to college and university in the late 80s, early 90s. There's always been silly courses and everyone knew, okay, if you want an easy A, if you want to blow off class for this semester, take this one because it's, it's a pretty much of a joke or whatever, right? They've always had those silly things, but no one gave them credence. But now we're lending credence to these things that we shouldn't.
And I think a lot of the stuff that we're doing currently in the United States, when it comes to higher ed, like dropping standardized tests, it's like, oh, great. So you want to further embed the class privilege of overwhelmingly upper class white progressives, which I think is not unintentional. I think there's a sense that kind of these tests keep privileged kids out, and that's one of the reasons why they want them to go. It's not like nominally it's about getting more minority applicants in there, but guess what? The standardized tests were put there to do. They were originally, the idea was to get promising poor people into higher ed, and it's one of the reasons why, like, a lot of on Twitter, at least in the neighborhoods that I hang out in, a lot of us who are also I'm a first generation American, my parents are immigrants, saying like, no, that's why I'm successful. Is that it turned out I was weirdly good at one of these tests, and they had to let me into these upper class institutions like Stanford, or didn't have to, but it definitely allowed me to get noticed by places like that. And getting rid of it's just so self-serving and backwards, that it at least opens the opportunity, though, as I think it's likely that affirmative action is probably going to be overturned in the United States, at least with regard to higher education, sometime in like the next year. And I think that and I think you can actually have a defense of affirmative action if you base on what Bakke actually said back in the 70s. But regardless of what you think about it, I think that some schools should basically be like, okay, well, if these other schools are going to be striving in every way away from a standardized test, I think like a couple schools that are kind of like, well, actually, we're going to have in our charter that we're going to establish that you can only accept students on the basis of standardized tests and grades. I think that those schools are going to find that suddenly their graduates are greeted with a lot more excitement by the big corporate powers that be than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, also, like when you mentioned this, like I think of Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, because I was kind of following that case closely because I knew Astra Nomani.
What happened there?
So they did the same thing. They got rid of standardized testing, and they wanted to make it it was entrance was no longer on testing, entrance was no longer on merit, and they wanted to same thing. We want to have more Black students and Hispanic students. And sure enough, what happened was the number of white students went up, the number of Asian students went down, and I believe the Black students went up slightly, like 1% or 2% more, but it was massively increased in white students.
Shock upon shock.
Yeah, and I mean, I saw some of the meetings because, like I said, Astra was posting a lot of these. I mean, again, a lot of this awful stuff that's coming out now, and it's, I mean, just pure racism. It's, oh, well, you're white adjacent because you're Asian and things like that. And it's just like, you don't have the right to speak because you're not quite oppressed enough. Like I mentioned overcorrections, but again, I'm looking at this like maybe in a longer view, but if you look at places like Iran or the former Soviet Union, you mentioned Yugoslavia, like I'd worked in Bosnia for a while. Any place that's had authoritarian governments and had government control of speech, conspiracy theories like just start growing like wheat. And it's the same thing here. Like since I came back, I've just been seeing one kind of curtailing on speech. It's like, oh, we have to stop these conspiracy theories. I'm like, but you're creating more. Like now, like the example I'll use is COVID. It's just, I mean, there were people who were kicked off Twitter because they said something, and then like 6 months later or a year later, whatever they said turned out to be true. The person might be a crank and a nut, fine, but the thing you kicked them off for was true.
Well, let's take Jennifer Say, at Levi's, like whose point was that shutting down schools is going to be disastrous for education. Everybody agrees with that now. It's going to lead to huge gaps for younger people. I didn't actually realize, like, I thought she was like an anti-vaxxer. Like when I first went to talk to her, realized that what she said was that got her fired from Levi's, was what's considered common knowledge now. And the extent to which, this is a major theme of a book I'm working on with 22-year-old wunderkind Ricky Schlott, called very creatively "Canceling of the American Mind." I actually realized we didn't mention this before. I'm the co-author of a book called "Coddling of the American Mind" with my friend Jonathan Haidt, which came out in 2018. And making the point that when you create a situation in which you know that experts can actually face serious repercussions, or be fired for having the wrong opinion, you take a sledgehammer to the credibility of experts, and it leads to a situation where if the American public can correctly say, "Wow, wait a second, I know that you're finding out things that sound, to confirm, upper class, overwhelmingly white, progressive ideas." That when you find research that confirms that, it's like, okay, well, but could you even say anything? Would you even feel free to say anything contrary to that? Like if you found something that didn't map with that, would you actually be willing to even tell us? And if there's any answer that indicates, well, maybe not, that's disastrous. And meanwhile, what the perverse thing that it creates is and people on the left should be worried about this, is that it creates a situation in which things that just seem to confirm the lefty white upper class worldview get treated with a fair amount of suspicion by the rest of the United States. And it's only the things that actually contradict it, because it would have to be like a statement against interest. Essentially, like you would have to be like Roland Fryer coming out and saying, my research indicates that actually maybe African Americans aren't disproportionately targeted. Meanwhile, what's so striking to me about that is like the finding that Roland Fryer found was that American police shoot too many people, which is, of course, should be treated as ghastly and horrifying by everyone, but partially because we have this very homogenous, and I keep on stressing the fact that like this is like a white upper class, because it comes out in the data. The Hidden Tribe survey, like the extent, like, found that the 7% that they call progressive activists were the and it's like the upper 7% were the most educated and the wealthiest and most racially homogenous group in the United States, with one exception: the far right. And this has been my experience too. That essentially, like when I lived in Stanford, and when I lived in San Francisco and was in Silicon Valley, like the wokest of the woke were rich white dudes or girls. Like, and it's still when I have these arguments on Twitter, like how often it's like, okay, rich white dude, like who to whom this is very important and claims to speak for the people, you should probably recognize the fact that if you look at the past 10 years, the shift in attitude in terms of becoming more, what Matty Iglesias cleverly calls the Great Awakening, it's something that hit upper class white people. There hasn't been a similar massive shift in attitudes among black and brown people.
Yeah, I mean, okay, like again take Muslims. Up until George Bush Jr., Muslims were very Republican voting bloc in the United States. I mean, it's not a huge population anyways, but they were largely a Republican voting bloc, and now you might see a swing back in that direction. Like, I mean, you're just seeing what was going on in I believe it was in Michigan recently, where a bunch of Muslim parents were out speaking out against some of the books that were being used in schools and stuff like that. Actually, speaking about that, I wanted to ask you about this, because I've been reading a lot of this, and so I'm reading from teachers, and I'm reading from people in education, and then I'm reading from like activists and whatever. So some of the laws that they passed for like anti-CRT are now like the anti-gender stuff, and they're calling them book bannings. But someone like Robert Pondisio, I don't know if you know who he is or if you've read any. Yeah, and I mean, he's been writing a lot about education, and he put out something really very recently about like schools and school boards deciding what goes into schools, or even government coming out saying what goes into schools is something that's been going on for hundreds of years. It's not necessarily banning books. It's how much time do you have to teach the material. Now, you can disagree with their opinion, and you can disagree with their reasoning, but to call it a book banning is ridiculous. And I think that some of this, like using some of these terms, a book like, okay, the one that they're talking about a lot about is genderqueer. Taking a book like genderqueer out of a public school library, like a grade school library, right? So K-6 type of thing, is not the same as, jackbooted thugs going into your house, taking your books and bringing it out and burning them in the town square.
Yeah.
So I think we have to differentiate between things like that. So I know you don't really focus too much on the K-12 because that's a different set of laws than like universities and stuff. But
yeah,
like, would you mind like discussing like book banning as opposed to school making curriculum change?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So me and Bonnie Snyder and Adam Goldstein and Ryan Weiss, we all wrote something like a 6,000 word piece called 13 Things You Need to Know About like the Divisive Concepts Debate, which last year was the most popular thing on the FIRE website. And I think it's for this very reason, that it was a serious nonpartisan attempt to evaluate the divisive concepts laws. And, I made the point that I made earlier that applied to higher education, with some exceptions. These laws are unconstitutional. And the exceptions I'm thinking of are like North Carolina's law, which banned compelled speech, making people mouth ideas they don't agree with, which is perfectly constitutional. Not only is it constitutional, it's something that's required by the Great Barnett decision. When it comes to K-12, as wrong-headed as you might think some of these laws are, it's constitutional. I point out, to the distress of some people who want me to be more sort of like appeasing, that the argument that legislatures and democratic process should have no effect on what K-12 teaches is an argument against public funding of public education, against mandatory attendance of public education. And so, yeah, like those are those laws that applied to K-12 curriculum are constitutional. It gets a little more complicated when you talk about K-12 libraries. And the reason why it's a little more complicated with K-12 libraries is because that's considered to be more like the free speech rights of the students in question. And so just to break it down really simply, in K-12, the free speech rights of teachers is considered to be very weak. And it actually makes a fair amount of sense, particularly if you do have this idea that, democratic forces should actually have some say in what people's kids get taught. The strongest free speech rights in K-12 are parents and students themselves. And when you have something that looks more like a limitation on what students can read or say, then some extra considerations come in, particularly due to the PICO decision, which was a 1983, I think, decision, saying that banning books just on their viewpoint is unconstitutional. Requiring K-12 libraries to remove books just because politicians don't like the viewpoint expressed in them is arguably unconstitutional. However, part of that decision, and it's been pretty much recognized, that age appropriateness is, of course, something that could still be considered. So when it comes to things like genderqueer, which has a picture of of one of the main characters performing oral sex on a strap-on, that do I think that any court in the country would say that a legislature can say that needs to be excluded on the basis of age appropriateness? I think that every court would be on the side of the legislature that decided that this wasn't age appropriate. And meanwhile, of course, they can get these at local bookstores. They can get this at the public library. There's all sorts of different ways that they can get this material. But when it comes to To Kill a Mockingbird or books that are removed from K-12 just because
politicians don't like the viewpoint, then there still is a good claim there. But people have to remember that nothing took out the role of age appropriateness. And when you're focusing on some of these books, I think that courts would uphold legislatures that say remove these most controversial ones. And meanwhile, that's one of the reasons why this discussion can be frustrating, is because the two sides are like completely talking past each other. That essentially, when I see people on the right, they're mostly focused at some things like genderqueer. Meanwhile, people on the left are defending it, saying, pointing out some of the more ridiculous books that have been banned, which is fair, which is entirely fair, but just trying to sort of completely ignore the fact that there are books that would arguably be bannable under age appropriateness.
Yeah, and I mean, some of these things, because I remember seeing a picture of Gavin Newsom with a pile of books in front of him saying, "Oh, I'm reading these books for Banned Book Week." And a couple of the books that were in that stack were actually banned in California. Like I believe
which books?
I believe 1984 was.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I have to go back and take a look at the picture because this was about 6 or 7 months ago. But I remember a lot of people calling this out. And yeah, Kill a Mockingbird was on there and things like that. But I've been seeing this for, like I said, I keep calling them overcorrections because it keeps coming back and forth to these kind of things. And like going back to the anti-CRT laws or whatever you want to call them. Like I didn't read the one from North Carolina, but I read a few of them. And the one in Idaho, I thought was the best one I'd read because all it did was, and I believe it was Idaho, it just reiterated statewide and federal civil rights laws and said, you can't teach anything that goes against these laws, which I think, fine. You're just, buttressing those laws. Great. But my look on that was, okay, these are overcorrections. Nothing was done. Like you started seeing this stuff. Again, I started following it and I started paying attention to what was going on in K through 12. And I believe in 2018, there were 16 states that were having some form of CRT-based curriculum from K through 12. Mm. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I agree with John McWhorter that this is a religion. And I'm like, you've got a race version of intelligent design coming through school curriculum now, and you need to get it out. So when I saw all these laws coming in and people were freaking out, and I agree with them on certain aspects of it, but I'm like, you know what? You're looking like, if I was a parent and I was told, okay, yes, this racial stuff that's being taught in schools is illegal because it goes against the Civil Rights Act, but then these laws that are coming in are also illegal and they're going to need to be sued. If I was a parent, I'm like, you know what? I'll take the stuff that's illegal, but is not teaching my kid to be a racist, as opposed to stuff that's illegal and is teaching my kid to be racist. Mm-hmm. So I can see where these overcorrections are coming in from. And
and that's been one of the interesting one of the points that we really tried to make is we tried to actually, in that larger article and in Canceling of the American Mind, is to show what the laws actually say, because some of it, one of the great ironies on the ones that are most written most clearly to reflect existing anti-discrimination laws is that they sound very much like something that the founders of CRT, people like Richard Delgado and Mary Matsuda, very much supported in the 1980s. They just don't like it's being used in a way that they don't approve of.
Yeah. You'd mentioned Coddling the American Mind, and I was hoping we could talk about that. Now, sure. Again, it was a great book, and I've also spoken with Lenore Skenazy a while ago. Everyone seems to be going around saying, okay, well, this is a silver bullet. We need to fix education. We need to fix this. We need to fix that. And I was kind of like an outsider just looking at all this stuff. And, I was never any kind of pundit or anything like that. And I just come in and I'm like, the problem is so much bigger than just education.
Yeah.
Like when I reading the coddling and then speaking to Lenore about what's going on with little kids and stuff. It's like, not only are you not raising kids to be anti-fragile, to take Nassim Talib's term there, but you're also you're limiting parents. Like, parents have to be helicopter parents now. If you let your little kid go to the park across the street, you potentially have your neighbors calling, child protective services on you.
Yeah.
And so parents don't have the time to go through curriculum. Parents don't have the time to see what their kids are doing. Parents don't have the time to discuss things amongst themselves. And at the same point, you're depriving kids of, if you let kids make up their own choices, if you have them, give them enough rope, maybe if there was a book like Genderqueer in the school library, they would think, I don't need to read this. And, they can kind of make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, I know you've done a couple of series on Twitter about like revisiting the coddling of the American mind and seeing how things are going. Like, frankly, I see things getting worse and worse since that book came out. And I just like wondering, like, what do you think it's going to take for people to like wake out of their slumber? Like, is it, like I said, it's a multitude of things here.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I remember when we were finishing up Coddling the American Mind, and we tried to end on an optimistic note, when neither of us felt particularly optimistic. And we thought things were going to get worse. I don't think either of us thought it would get quite this much worse this quickly. But definitely we thought things were going to get worse before they got better. Canceling the American Mind is going to be a little different in a lot of ways, not the least of which is we tried to have no villains in Coddling the American Mind. But I do think that people who are still saying, and by the way, overwhelmingly upper class, highly educated white men, are some of the most aggressive about this, that cancel culture isn't even a real thing, is like, okay, no, I think that people should not take you seriously anymore if that's your main message. And what is it going to take? I don't know. I think that what I'm afraid of, and I wrote a long article for Reason magazine that I think it was like the January issue or something like that, and I called it the second great age of political correctness, partially being intentionally using a term that some people find offensive, but making the point that you can't let what terms you use be decided by the Twitter scolds. Like they're just going to want to make it something that means that the majority of Americans can't understand you anymore. But in the 90s, the politically correct, as the term was at the time, sort of ideology peaked on campus and then started to sort of be walked back. That PC became a joke in the larger society. The codes were defeated. Professors became less enamored of speech codes, and the children of the baby boomers started hitting campus in large numbers, and they were very good on free speech. And this led to a sense of like, whew, thank goodness that's over. And meanwhile, quietly, or not so quietly for those of us who worked at FIRE, things got much worse on campus. Actually, the number of speech codes increased. So by the time, as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about like more than 2/3 of schools had laughably unconstitutional speech codes, oftentimes identical to the ones that were defeated in the 80s and 90s. And that was overwhelmingly due to administrators. You had the increase of bias-related incident programs, which are now all over the country, and they allow for a much closer enforcement of orthodoxy on American college campuses than speech codes ever could have. And the point there was just that if the fever breaks, and I think it's broken to some degree, if things are not as crazy as they were in 2020, which is unsustainable, then eventually people are going to be like, well, phew, thank goodness that's over, and not have fixed the underlying problem. It's just going to repeat the same cycle where it's like really crazy, really bad for the past, several years. And then the media, not that the media's been paying good attention to this, the people will take their eye off the ball, and it's just going to be even worse in a shorter period of time. Like when we come back to this in maybe another 5 years, this time around, it's going to be even more entrenched, even crazier. So the answer is, I don't entirely know what's going to make the difference, but I do think that rethinking how we do higher education in K through 12 is pretty important.
I mean, you bring up a point there that I've kind of said the same thing. Like the old, I remember the old PC stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, I used to laugh about it because I heard some really stupid things. Like I heard, we don't want to use waiter or waitress. We only use the word waitron. Which is
was that a real one?
Yeah, that was a real one.
Waitron. Sounds like a transformer.
Well, because they wanted to be gender neutral, right? And they wanted to be politically correct.
I see. But wouldn't Waitron not be gender neutral? Wouldn't that be specifically female, like matron?
I look, man. It was a lot of it was stupidity. But what you said there, it's gone away.
Yeah,
it's the same. Like I'll give two examples of it. So was it 2015? Melissa Click, she was the media and journalism professor at Mizzou. She called for muscle on a student reporter, and then she got fired. I mean, I don't want to get into the was she right to get fired, but everyone's like, oh, see, the problem's fixed. I'm like, no, that should light alarm bells everywhere. Like what's going on in journalism schools. If a teacher in a journalism school is calling for muscle on a journalist, what's being taught in journalism schools?
Yeah.
I think the the grievance studies affair that Helen Pluckrose and Pete Boghossian and James Lindsay did, that should have strung alarm bells.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one that I think about that's more recent is right when the vaccines first came out for COVID and the CDC put out that recommendation that we think, it should be done by race instead of who's most affected by it. And the next day they pulled it and everyone's like, oh, see, it's all fixed. I'm like, but now you've got university medical departments asking doctors to take a pledge to diversity instead of do no harm. I'm like, so is it like this, like, are we so used to instantaneous results and everything through like the internet and Google and whatever that we think, oh, we'll see, we won and there's no fight. And like, if people lost the stomach for like long drawn out fights on this, I mean,
well, it's also the side that can change it, is very distracted about, and to be clear, I think genuinely scary things going on in the American right. So I think there's reason to be distracted. And they're not that prone to sort of self-reflection on some of this stuff anyway, because they think they're on the side of the angels. And that's the thing that makes change so difficult is the right is going to give them things to distract themselves with and be concerned about rightfully. And meanwhile, kind of like on the left, there's limited patience for saying that there's something wrong in higher education, like something wrong in K through 12, because the way they frame it too often is just that, well, no, but these are, I mean, everyone here means well. Everybody has good intentions, even if it's a little excessive. It's like, oh man, like, so yeah, so change is gonna be difficult. I think also society needs to adapt to a world like a social media world where I think Rob Henderson was getting at this point in his piece about why do adults care so much what kids think of them. I think it's a larger kind of like, why do thoughtful people care, what Twitter thinks of them, for example. But it can create, like an idea that kind of like, oh, my ideas are very, very unpopular when maybe they're only unpopular with a tiny fraction of the American public.
Something you'd mentioned there about, okay, like when I came back and I saw all the stuff that was going on, I just like, okay, right, left, liberal, conservative don't mean anything anymore. I just started jokingly calling myself an enlightenmentarian. I said, I support the values of enlightenment. Put me wherever you want on your political spectrum. This is what I support. But yeah, you were talking about the right and stuff. But there is my issue with, okay, take the Trump presidency.
Yeah.
There was so much focus. Like right when he got elected, there were a lot of people who said, oh, there were some of the excesses on the left were part of the reason why people voted for Trump.
Oh yeah, no,
okay.
I do think in a very real sense.
Okay, but then all of a sudden, majority of those people just went all Trump all the time, instead of trying to make their side more electable. And I'm like, okay, in 2020, it took a pandemic, what Time Magazine called a cabal of tech and media and whatever to get together and try to push the election one way. I mean, I can't remember the exact quotes in the Time article, and then like crushing the Hunter Biden story to have Trump elected. I'm like, that's not a win for your side. You didn't make your side more electable. I keep going back to I mean, because Hitchens used to bring this play up a lot, the Man for All Seasons, that scene where Thomas More asked Roper, like, are you willing to burn down all the laws in England to catch the devil? And it's like, yeah, I will. And that's what I look at what quote unquote the left has become. Mm-hmm. Like everything that used to protect you from the crazy has now itself become crazy. So you've got nowhere left to hide. Like, I mean, thank God for places like the Fire, because the ACLU is a pale shadow of what it used to be, even just like 3 or 4 years ago. And it's like, what do you have left to defend yourself against the nuttiness from other sides?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think about the sort of like lost opportunity for Republicans, because there's a guy named Alan Lichtman who teaches at American University, who has a pretty Byzantine, not Byzantine's unfair. He has a pretty complicated equation to figure out who's going to win each election, like whose side was it on. And I actually went into 2016 assuming that since incumbency is so powerful that it would actually be likely that Hillary would win. And I didn't bother to check in with Alan Lichtman himself, who was like, no, this was the Republicans' year to lose for a number of different factors in his equation. And I think that if the Republicans, since incumbency is very strong, and it takes a lot to be an incumbent president who loses, that if it had been any other president, like if the Republicans had chosen literally anybody else, they would have easily had a two-timer. And I think you're right. On the left, meanwhile, the lesson is like, well, we don't have to change anything, and it's like, But at the same time, the fact that they ran, I do have to remember though, like, and this was very clear. The fact that they ultimately went with Biden was clear that they knew they had to go with their most sort of center appealing candidate that they had. Meanwhile, when I feel like the next closest was probably Buttigieg, and I talked to people, in this town who are also Democrats, and there's like, oh well, no, he's unelectable, like because he's too centrist, and it's like, okay, we got a problem.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. Thank you very much for coming on. But if you want to give a last, plea for, the culture of free speech, not so much the laws, like
Sure,
why it's important. Because I mean, like, this is something I try to talk to my friends about, whatever. And it's just, it's always the safety thing that comes up on my end. It's like, oh, we have to protect people.
yeah. Well, I think the best defense of freedom of speech is simply that it works very well, and it tells you where your problems are, and it lets you be grounded in the world as it actually is. And I think right now, the more you censor, the less accurate your picture of the world becomes. And I think that can lead to some real horrible downstream disasters. And I think you should, and if I could, preach one virtue for Americans right now, it's curiosity, a curiosity about your fellow citizens. Try to figure out what they really think, where they're really coming from, without that idea that, they're either stupid or evil. It was kind of, utterly predictable, but also heartbreaking to watch when the New York Times, chastened by the election of Trump, was like, you know what, we need to add people like Barry Weiss and James Bennett to the New York Times to get us better in touch with the rest of the country. And then as soon as it actually tried to do articles about right-wing extremists, it was treated as normalizing right-wing extremism, when it was actually trying to figure out where they were coming from, not normalizing it in any sense. As you know, James Bennett and Barry Weiss are now long gone. So I do think that, and I think that once you send that message that we don't really want to know what the even the worst of the other side looks like, it's putting you on a road to disaster. I guess, which is not the most inspiring way to talk the high value of free speech, but I do think that we badly need it, and even more than we think we do right now.
Yeah, I mean, I look around. I mean, again, in Canada, it's just, we're having the inquiry into the Emergencies Act, and I mean, I was out in Vancouver a little while ago, and I was speaking to some friends out there, and I live in Montreal, so it's like whatever 3,000 miles away, and that convoy that came into Ottawa. Speaking to people in Vancouver who only watched media and only watched certain media, it's like their perception of it is so wrong. And I'm like, well, these inquiries are going on. They're speaking to people. It's like, someone will come up and say, oh, Uber Eats wouldn't deliver in Ottawa during the convoy. And then you have people coming on saying, here are all my receipts from Uber Eats during the convoy. And I live like right downtown Ottawa, and they were coming delivering to my place. So it's, sorry, I don't want to drag, but it's like the polarization, like they're purposely making their polarization worse because they're siling themselves off into these little, little bubbles of, okay, I'm only going to listen to this. And I mean, okay, don't get me wrong. The other side of it too, I had friends in Vancouver who were telling me about how these people who had the largest ivermectin factory in the world were killed just 2 weeks before COVID became a pandemic, and this and that. I'm like, okay, the conspiracy theories on both sides have to stop. They're getting a little nutty here. But yeah, it's just like my whole thing is you're not going to know what's going on. Conspiracy theories are going to spread like wildfire. And if you want a reasonable, rational world, you need to have that speech. You need to allow even the speech you find the most distasteful. And that's my take on it. Well, once again, thank you very much, Greg. It was great talking to you. If you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, where they can get a hold of Fire, and I'll put like the links in the description.
Sure. Yeah, thefire.org is Fire's email address. And I am G Lukianoff, if you can spell my last name, on Twitter. And the name of the book was Coddling the American Mind, but the next book is going to be Canceling the American Mind, because I'm incredibly creative.
Well, thanks a lot again. It was great talking to you.
Absolutely. Take care. Good chatting with you.
Thanks everyone for listening.